The Gilded Shadow, A Tale of the Devil in the White City in 1893. Chicago gleamed like a city of dreams, but in the shadows of the White City, behind plaster walls and locked doors, a man was building something far darker than progress itself, a machine of death disguised as a hotel where ambition, trust, and innocence would vanish forever. They called it the White City because it gleamed, because it pretended purity, order, and progress were things that could be engineered in marble and electricity. But every city casts a shadow, and in 1893, as America stood on the brink of a new century, that shadow learned how to smile. On the morning the gates of the world's Columbian Exposition opened, Chicago smelled of rain-soaked timber, coal smoke, perfume, and ambition. Lake Michigan lay flat and gray like a sheet of metal, hammered smooth by industry itself. Bells rang. Brass bands rehearsed the same triumphant bars again and again. Men in tailored coats adjusted their watches, convinced history was finally keeping time with them. No one noticed the man standing slightly apart from the crowd. He was neither poor nor wealthy in appearance. His coat was clean but unremarkable, his mustache neatly trimmed, his eyes calm in a way that suggested discipline rather than kindness. He watched families pour through the gates, wives clutching parasols, children wide-eyed at the electric lights that defied the sun itself. He did not come for the Ferris wheel. He did not come for the future. He came because the future made people. Careless. His name, when spoken, was Henry Howard Holmes. His real name, buried like a body beneath aliases, was Herman Webster Mudgett, and Chicago would remember him long after the plaster palaces crumbled into dust. The Gilded Age was not gilded because it was golden. It was gilded because something cheaper lay beneath. America in the late 19th century worshipped scale, bigger factories, taller buildings, faster trains, louder promises. The nation had learned how to produce miracles mechanically, and it had not yet learned the cost of doing so. Chicago was the cathedral of this belief. Raised from the ashes of the Great Fire of 1871, the city rebuilt itself with a ferocity bordering on mania. Steel skeletons climbed toward the clouds. Rail lines knotted the nation together with iron certainty. Meat-packing plants transformed animals into profit with assembly line efficiency. That would later inspire Henry Ford and horrify generations to come. People arrived daily. Immigrants, dreamers, widows, salesmen, women with just enough money to try again somewhere new, and predators. Holmes had arrived years earlier, long before the White City existed outside blueprints and political speeches. He came with credentials, medical training, polite manners, a voice that suggested intelligence without warmth. He understood something fundamental about American trust. People believed paperwork. More than people, he bought a pharmacy on the corner of Wallace and 63rd Street in Englewood, a neighborhood swelling with newcomers. The previous owner died suddenly. Few asked questions. Fewer remembered his name. Above the pharmacy, Holmes began to build, not upward alone but inward, rooms without windows, staircases that climbed and stopped, hallways that narrowed into nothing, doors that locked only from the outside, chutes disguised as laundry shafts, gas lines threaded where no gaslight should be. It was not a castle in the medieval sense. It was something far more modern. It was a system. When the World's Fair was announced, an event meant to celebrate for 100 years. Since Columbus discovered a land already inhabited, Holmes recognized opportunity with surgical clarity. Millions would come. They would need rooms. They would trust advertisements. They would disappear easily. The city was preparing to dazzle the world. Holmes was preparing to harvest it. The White City itself rose like a dream imposed on reality. Architects Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted envisioned symmetry, reflection, and order, an antidote to the chaos of industrial cities. Buildings coated in staff, a white plaster mixture, reflected electric light so brilliantly that visitors claimed it felt like walking through daylight at midnight. Nikola Tesla's alternating current powered wonders that seemed like sorcery. Elevators glided, fountains glowed, Music floated across artificial lagoons. And beneath it all, Chicago's older instincts stirred. Crime rates climbed, confidence schemes flourished. Newspapers sensationalized everything because outrage sold. Faster than truth, Holmes read every paper. He understood timing. Women were his preferred victims not because of weakness, but because society underestimated their absence. A single woman traveling alone was freedom itself in 1893. And freedom came with risk no one liked to name. He hired them, secretaries, clerks, assistants. He insured them, he courted them, he erased them. Bodies were stripped of identity through acid, fire, or sailed to medical schools, and irony Holmes enjoyed privately, given his own medical education. Skeletons fetched a good price. Science asked few questions when specimens arrived clean and labeled. Progress was hungry. Yet Holmes was not merely a killer. That would have been too simple. He was an entrepreneur of death, perfectly adapted to the moral blind spots of his era. Insurance fraud, property scams, fake inventions. Each crime rehearsed the same principle: exploit systems designed for trust. And America trusted systems more than souls. When visitors wandered the fairgrounds marveling at the future, Holmes wandered too. He observed faces flushed with wonder, minds loosened by novelty. He knew which ones would answer an advertisement, which ones would follow him back to Englewood. The White City showed people what America wanted to be. Holmes showed it what it already was. By the time the fair closed, over 27 million people had passed through its gates. The buildings would be torn down. The lights would go dark. The nation would move on. But the shadow it cast would stretch far longer than anyone imagined. And it would not be finished killing. The Gilded Shadow, a tale of the devil in the White City. Chicago never slept during the fair. It only pretended to rest. At night, the White City glowed like a mirage pinned to the edge of Lake Michigan, its electric lights shimmering across the water as if the future itself had decided to linger. Couples strolled along the midway plaisance, where cultures were reduced to attractions and wonder was sold by the ticket. The Ferris wheel turned slowly, deliberately, lifting passengers high enough to believe that perspective was the same thing as understanding. Holmes preferred the hours after midnight. That was when people stopped performing optimism and began negotiating with themselves. When loneliness spoke louder than caution. When a stranger offering guidance felt like providence rather than risk. His building in Englewood, already whispered about as a castle, though no turret crowned it, waited patiently. Brick by brick, room by room, it had been designed. Not to impress, but to confuse. Holmes understood architecture the way generals understood terrain. Space was a weapon if you controlled it. A guest entering the building rarely noticed anything amiss at first. The lobby was respectable. The pharmacy downstairs smelled of antiseptic and soap. Holmes greeted visitors with the soft authority of a physician, a man trained to be trusted. Trust was the first lock. One woman, her real name lost to time, preserved only in fragments of testimony, and room arrived from Indiana in the summer of 1893. She had answered an advertisement promising employment near the fairgrounds. Her family remembered her excitement more than her details. That, too, was common. Holmes showed her to a room on the upper floor. The door closed, and the building began to breathe. Gas jets hissed faintly behind walls. Locks slid into place silently. Holmes did not rush. He rarely did. Panic exhausted itself quickly in enclosed spaces, and exhaustion made everything easier. When it was over, the city absorbed another absence without comment. Chicago had learned how to do that. Police forces of the era were local, fragmented, and chronically underfunded. Jurisdictional boundaries were convenient shields for anyone who understood them. Holmes did. He crossed state lines often, using aliases as casually as others used hats. He was not hiding, he was operating. Yet, even systems built on indifference eventually experience friction. It began with money. Holmes had always believed he could outsmart insurance companies forever. After all, they were abstractions buildings full of clerks and forms, not people. But abstraction cuts both ways. Clerks notice patterns. Files accumulate weight. When bodies disappeared, paperwork remained and paperwork, unlike people, did. Not forget, the first serious crack appeared far from Chicago in the crude heat of Texas. Holmes had traveled there with a man named Benjamin Pittizel, a carpenter, a drunk. A man loyal enough to be useful and desperate enough to be disposable. Pittizel was supposed to fake his own death for an insurance scheme. Instead, Holmes killed him. Efficiency had replaced partnership. The plan unraveled quickly after that. Pittizel's children vanished next. Holmes moved them from city to city: Cincinnati, Indianapolis. Toronto, always one step ahead, always promising reunions that never came. America was big. But grief was persistent. Detective Frank Geyer of the Philadelphia police was not brilliant, nor famous, nor especially imaginative. What he was, however, was methodical. He followed receipts, train records, hotel registers, muddy footprints in empty houses. The trail Holmes left behind was not obvious, but it was there. Bones were discovered buried in cellars, children's belongings surfaced in abandoned rooms, testimony accumulated like sediment. And slowly, the story long before juries argued over Holmes's guilt, long before reporters turned his smile into a brand. The victims had already been edited out of history. They did not vanish all at once. They faded. A boarding house ledger with a name crossed out. A trunk never claimed at a railway station. A letter returned unopened, stamped unknown. In the Gilded Age, disappearance was not an event, it was an administrative inconvenience. America was too busy inventing itself to notice who fell between the gears. Holmes understood that better than any sociologist ever would. One young woman, newly arrived from Iowa, had written to her sister about the building. She described the owner as refined and almost too polite. A man who spoke of opportunity with the calm certainty of someone who had already succeeded. Her last letter mentioned the strange layout doors that seemed to lead nowhere, a staircase that stopped abruptly at a wall. She laughed about it in ink. No one ever found her again. The architecture was not random. Investigators later struggled to map the building because it resisted logic. Holmes had hired and fired construction crews constantly, ensuring no one understood the full design. Workers built walls only to tear them down. Doors were installed and sealed behind plaster. Some rooms were soundproofed. Others were lined with metal to conduct heat. The building was not haunted. It was intentional. And intention was far more frightening. Yet Holmes was not alone in shaping his legend. The newspapers were eager collaborators. The late 19th century was the golden age of yellow journalism. Sensation sold, horror sold better. Holmes was not just a criminal, he was content. Reporters competed to outdo one another with lurid details, sketch artists elongated shadows. Headlines screamed numbers no one could verify. America's first serial killer, they called him. It was a lie, but it was a useful one. By framing Holmes as an anomaly, the nation could avoid asking harder questions about labor conditions, about unregulated medicine, about how easily a man could exploit trust when profit was the organizing principle of society. Holmes was easier to hang than those ideas. In his cell, Holmes continued to perform. He sold his confessions to newspapers. Each version contradicted the last. In one, he was a possessed madman. In another, a cold-blooded strategist. Sometimes he wept, sometimes he boasted. The truth lay somewhere quieter. He was bored. Execution was the one event he could not reschedule, renegotiate, or monetize beyond a certain point. Even his death became a transaction his body sold to science under conditions he specified himself. Control until the end. On May 7, 1896, Holmes walked to the gallows without protest. Witnesses remarked on his composure. The trapdoor fell. His neck did not break immediately. He strangled slowly, his face darkening, his body refusing to yield. It took over 15 minutes. Some said it was fitting, others said nothing. But execution did not end the story. It merely freed it. In the decades that followed, Holmes became a myth flexible enough to survive scrutiny. True crime before the term existed, a villain polished until he's shown, books embellished, lectures dramatized, his victims blurred into statistics 20-7, 50 to 100. Numbers replace names. And numbers, like buildings, could be admired without empathy. Meanwhile, America continued to build, cities grew taller, corporations larger, systems more abstract. Identity became something that could be documented, ensured, erased. The lessons Holmes embodied were not rejected, they were absorbed, sanitized, and scaled. The modern age did not fear him. It learned from him. In Chicago, the site of the old building changed hands repeatedly. People lived there, loved there, died ordinary deaths there. Children played where hallways once misled screams into silence. Life reclaimed the space. But stories lingered. Every generation rediscovers Holmes when it feels uneasy about progress. When technology outruns ethics. When institutions feel impersonal. When evil looks clean, educated, and polite, he returns because he is familiar. Because he reminds Americans that monsters do not always snarl, sometimes they build. And the White City? It exists now only in photographs, perfect, luminous, impossible. A dream America once dared to dream about itself, but every dream needs darkness to appear bright. Holmes understood that too. The shadow that outlived the city, Gilded Shadow, was never merely a story of one man. Henry Howard Holmes or Herman Webster Mudgett, depending on which alias the records remembered, was a symptom, not the disease. His crimes were shocking, horrifying, and methodical. Yet the deeper horror was that he operated within a society, eager to trust systems more than people, dazzled by spectacle and distracted by progress. The White City, with its gleaming towers, electric lights, and artificial lagoons, was not only a symbol of America's aspiration, it was a mirror of its blind spots. For every triumph on the fairgrounds, there were gaps where greed, ambition, and cruelty could hide. Holmes exploited those gaps with a precision that made him almost invisible, even as he committed acts beyond comprehension. In the end, the city outlived its creator and its predator. Chicago rebuilt. America moved forward. Newspapers sensationalized, historians codified, and pop culture mythologized. Yet the story persists because it asks a question every generation must answer: how? Do we reconcile progress with morality, innovation with accountability, and the pursuit of greatness with the value of human life? Holmes is gone, his building burned, his body executed, his name etched in history books. But the shadow he cast endures not as legend, not even as horror, but as a warning that the structures we build, no matter how magnificent, can conceal more than they reveal, and that evil is most terrifying when it wears the mask of civility. The White City glimmered for a brief moment in the sunlight, dazzling the world with its promise. But every light casts a shadow, and some shadows are gilded.